Lineage Under Siege by Jack Nganga. Copyright 2025 by Jackson Nananjogu. All rights reserved. Revised and published by Jack Trade Publishers. Revised on 10th March 2025. Those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Sir Winston Churchill. Dedicated to my daughters Wanjiku and Wanjiru. List of chapters. Chapter 1 Ancestors and Demons, 1890–1907. Chapter 2 Villagers and Missionaries, 1914–1916. Chapter 3 Natives and Settlers, 1916–1936. Chapter 4 Freedom Fighters and Colonialists, 1945–1961. Chapter 5 Civilians and SODIERS, 1961–1989. Chapter 6 Hustlers and Politicians, 1992–2020. Prologue. On the frontiers of the Great Aberdare Range, out in the vast territories that would come to exist one day as Central Kenya, missionaries from Europe came spreading the gospel and civilizing the Kikuyu people they met there around the year 1890. The Kikuyu nation, or Ajikuyu, according to their own dialectic pronunciation, lived in huts, which they built with doors facing the great mountain Kirinyaga, later known as Mount Kenya, a sacred place they believed was home to their god, Nai, or Mwenenyaga, whom they worshipped under a fig tree. To them, the fig tree was as sacred as it was indigenous, referring to it as Magumo. They lived close to one another but remotely apart enough to rear big families alongside plenty of crops and livestock. The farming was roughly communal and the harvest was shared among members of the same clan or settlement, according to clanship division and labor investment. Nonetheless, personal land ownership was starting to become a common feature among the Kikuyu people as their population increased at the turn of the 20th century. With an archaeology history tracing back to the 3rd century, the Kikuyu, part of the northeastern Bantu people, had at some point in the Middle Ages believed to have broken away from a larger group known as Thajichu, far north of the Great Mountain, settling all over the fertile highlands surrounding the mountain. Upon finding a favorable climate there, they became the most tropically resilient tribe in pre-colonial East Africa, thus attaining significant affluence, and also becoming the most feared. When Arab traders once ventured their trading caravans into Kikuyu territory, perhaps with an intention to capture slaves, they were countered with brutal force by the Kikuyu warriors, resulting in severe casualties, enough to deter them from ever returning. However, the Kikuyu had no clue that their reign and dominance was about to end, when Great Britain earmarked East Africa for colonial conquest. Great European explorers and traders had been roaming about East Africa for decades prior to the advent of British colonialism. Many of them had been peaceful men who had even forged bonds of goodwill with African chiefs, before moving on and leaving the Africans undisturbed and free to continue with their old ways. However, some of the explorers were also agents of overseas governments and trading companies who reported home about the great prospects of the vast idle lands, thus triggering European governments to rush and annex land they thought belonged to no one. In the name of expanding their royal empires, the scramble and partition of Africa had begun. Great Britain at the dawn of the 20th century had become an imperial power with vast resources and manpower the likes of which the world had never seen before, and it had its roving eye on East Africa, especially the fertile highlands that were home to the Kikuyu people. Great Britain had initially sponsored Christian missionaries to venture into unexplored African territories and bathe the native tribes with Christian beliefs, which was perhaps a ruthless attempt to assimilate Africans into Western culture and make colonialism easier. While this worked instantly with some tribes, it did not go quite as planned with the Kikuyu. The missionaries, using their charm, advertised the gospel to the Kikuyu in the name of God and there was no problem, but when they held the door open for the colonialists to come in, pointing their guns, pushing the Kikuyu off their land, in the name of the king, there was a problem. The Imperial British East Africa Company raided many African communities, killing men and women by their hundreds and confiscating countless heads of cattle and goats, or whatever else seemed valuable, and somehow converting these spoils of war into resources they needed to affirm their authoritative establishment in the land. Some tribes surrendered their land, some blindly signed it away in controversial treaties, while some died fighting for it. These manifolds of atrocities that went largely unrecorded caused a great embarrassment to the British Home Government, which put a stop to them, but never removed its focus on the environmentally friendly wonder that was the highlands of East Africa. While the goal of colonialism was to amass land and resources needed for imperial sustainability, civilization of Africans was either a preliminary excuse or an inevitable byproduct. The Kikuyu did not need Western civilization, certainly not missionaries to tell them how to relate to God, nor a system of government. They already had well-organized religious and political institutions. To begin with, they had their own creation theory as how the world came to exist, involving the first ancestral parents, a man called Gikuyu and his wife Mombai, whose 9 daughters allegedly became the matriarchal pillars of the entire Kikuyu society. Whatever the case, the Kikuyu came to adopt their own moral code of ethics, presided over by a council of elders, that they referred to as Kihuto, whose duty it was to uphold justice. The council of elders was in total command of the jubilant Kikuyu warriors, referred to as Njama, whose role was to enforce the laws within the community, as well as defend the community's land and livestock against external threats, especially neighboring tribes like the Maasai. Other important public service occupations in Kikuyu society comprised of medicine men, tanners, potters, blacksmiths and even rainmakers when drought prevailed. The Kikuyu also dressed in garments crafted from locally sourced materials, primarily animal hides and plant-based fabrics. Their traditional sense of fashion was both practical and well-suited to the climate, while also serving as a reflection of social status, age, and specific occasions. However, many Kikuyu folks were struck with awe at the sight of the white man and his pale skin, believing his god must hold some greater power than their own. Either this was the arrogance the missionaries needed to start converting Kikuyus to Christianity, or it was the deception the British government was counting on, to dominate East Africa by way of British imperialism. Introduction. There was an old man called Wanjui Karua, who lived in a remote village that lay at the northern foot of the Great Aberdare Range. He had waited a lifetime to become the village headman, a position the British would later generalize to mean chief. But in his old age, he found himself the leader of a village that was slowly and blindly playing host to British imperialism. The missionaries were doing their conversions, but on a much grander scale, the colonialists were drawing their maps. The village was called Mukuyu, named after a revered indigenous tree. It was home to over 1,000 or so inhabitants, who were scattered across hundreds of acres of communal land, divided among various family clans. Each clan traced its lineage to one of the 9 daughters of Gikuyu and Mombai, the first ancestors of Kikuyu society according to folklore. However, folklore notwithstanding, by mid-19th century, the original 9 clans had expanded into hundreds of sub-clans and kinship clusters within Kikuyu society as a whole, with each clan now identifying itself by a patriarchal family name. There were 13 family clans in Mukuyu village. The Kikuyu people in Mukuyu village, just like everywhere else, could not imagine their lives without their land, and so, they disregarded all reports about land acquisition within other Kikuyu and non-Kikuyu communities afar, choosing to be friendly to the missionaries who had come smiling and preaching the message of another god apart from their own. They saw no harm in the religious whites, but little did they know that another version of them, driven by duty for empire and greed for power, were about to pay them a visit too. However, the majority of the Kikuyu, no matter where they lived, were proud and resolute, believing they had a spiritual connection to the land, for which they equated with their very lives. Their traditional economy thrived on the thorough cultivation of millet, which was their staple crop, alongside peas, beans, sorghum, arrowroots, and sweet potatoes. Goats and cows were raised for their meat, milk, and rawhides, but poultry keeping had not yet become common among Kikuyu communities at that time. The old man, Wanjui Karua, spent many sleepless nights brooding the tough times ahead. The whole village seemed fascinated by the foreign culture and sympathetic to a new religious philosophy that held a man who was allegedly crucified on a cross where he died for the sins of all men on earth. Many villagers converted to Christianity, embracing a new belief system that did not sit well with Kikuyu customary laws. If old age had taught Wanjui Karua anything, it was that a loss of identity only opened the door for more things to be lost. What were the Kikuyu people going to lose next? The old man could not stop wondering. Whatever the case, Wanjui Karua knew there was blood eager to be shed at some point between the most conservative Kikuyu landholders and the mounting mobs of white forces who were eager to become the new landlords. It was not exactly the sort of environment a man could raise a son or take pride as the people's chief. Wanjui Karua despised his role. Every day, he thought of his young son, just 4 moons away from his initiation, the step toward manhood, marriage, and the hope of providing his father with much-needed grandsons to carry on the family name. The boy was his sole concern, the only reason he was still hanging on to life. Wanjui Karua was determined to pass down whatever wisdom his son would need, along with the wealth he would leave behind upon entering the next life. Nevertheless, his old age and the growing presence of whites in the village gave him no peace, especially when he imagined the uncertain world his son would soon have to navigate.